Hey there, my name is James Scott. I'm a librarian at the Sacramento Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to Valley to Vietnam. Valley to Vietnam is a joint venture between the Vietnam Veterans of America Chapter 500 and the Sacramento Public Library. It's our intent to trace the arc of experience of our local Vietnam veterans as they went from Sacramento, California, many other spots, to Vietnam, and then back again. And this week's guest is Tom Fante, who served with the Army Security Agency in Vietnam. Tom, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, welcome home. So you are a Northern California kid and grew up in the San Francisco area. We're going to start off our discussion today with a phrase. I'm going to just go ahead and spit it out to you, and I want you to tell me what it makes you think of. Victory at sea.
Well, Richard Rodgers wrote the music for Victory at Sea, which was a documentary based on World War II, which I watched as a 5-year-old boy in San Bruno. And I think it gave me a sense of World War II that was glorious and I say went deep inside me and kind of conditioned the way I looked at war thereafter.
Right, and of course, like so many young men at this time and young fellows who would go to Vietnam, their dads had served in Europe or the Pacific, and of course your dad was one of those folks.
My father was a captain in a railroad battalion and served in World War II from 42 to 46. He ended up in Stuttgart, Germany, where he was in charge of denazification and putting the Stuttgart rail yard back together so that it was functioning. He came home in 46, and while I was watching Victory at Sea in one room, his uniform was hanging in the closet, and I often went to look at it and look at the brass. He served there, as did virtually everyone's father whom I knew. They all served there, and they were all back after the war was over, demobilized and pursuing their careers.
Right, and it was just kind of the way things were, and so you're growing up, the war ends, and then all of a sudden we've got the media and certain companies making these fantastic documentaries, Victory at Sea. In fact, in the 70s, I can remember sitting on my grandfather's lap in Portland, Oregon, watching Victory at Sea, kind of a timeless production that if you're an American, you just kind of know about.
Nobody questioned that war needed to be fought, and there was no opposition to that war that I'm aware of, no significant opposition. My father volunteered. He had a hernia. He didn't have to go, but he insisted on going, and he received a direct commission based on his knowledge of railroading, and was attached to the railroad battalion that was ultimately sent to Europe, and he followed the front line, restoring the tracks and the rail centers as the troops moved on into Germany, and he ended up in Stuttgart, as I mentioned.
Right, and of course you've got this military heritage, strong military heritage, that you've sort of digested through the 40s, and you're moving into the 50s, and soon it becomes clear that you were going to head on to college, right? And that would be University of California at Berkeley. Now, in the early 60s, we have certain figures. We have Mario Savio, we have Jerry Rubin, and a burgeoning free speech movement, and then a burgeoning sort of tied to that anti-war movement. Talk a little bit about that, and of course, as it sort of moves toward Vietnam, if you could.
Well, at Berkeley, I attended class and I walked back and forth in front of Sproul Hall 3 or 4 times a day, and that's where the free speech movement was centered, at least the public face of it, and that's where Mario Savio spoke on the steps of Sproul Hall. And if I remember right, perhaps on top of a car that was trapped there for quite a while. And that was a campus issue, whether or not certain groups were allowed to have tables set up in front of Sproul Hall and certain other free speech issues. But the next year, I recall it being more morphing toward Vietnam, because Vietnam had suddenly occurred to most of us men at the time that we were going to be drafted, that war was going to come and take us when we graduated if we couldn't think of a way to get out of it. And so opposition to that war very rapidly developed, and I think in part because the war was not considered necessary. The war was not considered worthwhile in the sense that we were not supporting anyone but a corrupt dictatorship in South Vietnam against the communists. So it was more of an anti-communist sort of thing rather than a pro-democracy war. So, and the fact that we were going to be drafted lent a very big spark to how people, especially men, felt about it. As I came to graduate from Berkeley, I hadn't really thought too much about that war, as perhaps I should have. I knew I didn't agree with it. It wasn't anything like the war my father had fought, and there was a lot of opposition to it. A lot of people felt that we were bombing people who shouldn't be bombed, that we were guilty of atrocities and various other things that were occurring. And soldiers at the time were rather low in the public estimate. And so I really didn't want to be one, and nor did I know anybody who did. Most of the people that I did know spent that last year figuring out how they would get out of going. I had a roommate who was a conscientious objector. He got out that way. I knew two guys who found a psychiatrist with the code name Dr. Light in Fresno, supposedly. And he wrote them a letter, or they got a letter saying that they were probably gay, or they were gay, and they showed that to their draft boards, at least this according to what I was told, and that got them out of that. I knew another fellow who went to Canada without knowing, of course, that he could ever come back. Right. None of those ways out of the war appealed to me. I was not gay, and I didn't choose to lie about it to get out of the war. And I wasn't a conscientious objector either, because I believe some wars should be justified, like the World War II. The necessary war. And I really didn't want to flee to Canada and never come back again, potentially. So I ended up with my draft notice on my bureau at home, and me deciding to volunteer in some other branch of the service than the one that was carrying most of the rifles. And I found that branch through a recruiter, and a couple of them came out and saw me, and my father, both. We were living in Arizona at the time, and they came out and they said, now, if you would join up for 4 years in the Army Security Agency, you wouldn't actually have to go to Vietnam, because there are no Army Security Agency in Vietnam. A very amusing tale, they told me, and I believed it because I suppose I wanted to. My father believed it too. So it was with great surprise that in the middle of my advanced training in Morse code, that I discovered that I was in fact going to Vietnam, and so was everybody else that was in that program. So I discovered then that they in fact just lied to me. Right. But it was a little late to complain about that, and so I ended up going to Vietnam and fighting in a war that I didn't necessarily think ought to be fought. In fact, I don't believe to this day that we should have been there, and I think the result kind of proves the contention that we should not have been there, because we trade now with Vietnam. There was no domino effect, although there was a terrible massacre in Cambodia, obviously, coming later on. So at any rate, that takes me to
Yeah. So that takes you to Pleiku. And so you do the standard boot camp. So you go to Fort Ord and then get your training for the ASA, and then you move to Pleiku. So tell us a bit about what the Army Security Agency did and what your specific task was.
Well, the Army Security Agency listened, at least my part of it, for Morse code transmission sent by North Vietnamese and South Viet Cong units, presumably to gather intelligence of one kind or another, perhaps order of battle information, knowing which units were where, and so forth. So we we listened to the dits and the dots.
Got it.
And in Vietnam, in Pleiku. I got to Pleiku via Saigon. I was actually, it's a very strange story in a way, because it took me a while to get to do what I was supposed to do, and then I didn't do that for very long before I did something else. So I got to Saigon, got off that airplane, and got my whiff of Vietnam, as I think most of us did, that surprising combination of odors and bad odors, all mixed together. And I spent about 2 or 3 weeks in what they called the St. George Hotel, which was a sort of a high-rise bunker with no windows, made entirely of cement. And I had my own cot with, actually I didn't need any bedding because it was so hot that it was been superfluous. But I spent the day, I'd say, almost wandering about in Saigon, but actually under orders, digging holes for what we call piss tubes, digging holes for filling sandbags, and just going from one place to another to do that. I was so tired at the end of the day, I really didn't feel like doing much more than coming back and crashing in my bunk. So during those days in Saigon, I really didn't get to see much, except as I was walking to and from the various places where I dug all the holes. My orders were to Pleiku. I got those orders in Fort Devens, where I took my training, and I thought Pleiku was a good place to go if you were going to Vietnam, because I hadn't heard about anything going on there. Now, I'd heard a lot about Da Nang, and there was another ASA unit there, and I certainly didn't want to go there. So my orders were canceled, and I was sent to our headquarters to get new orders, and the orders were blank, so I stood in line until somebody was going to fill out where I was going to go. And of course, I kept hearing Da Nang, Da Nang, Da Nang, Da Nang, and I thought, geez, this is not a place I want to be, is Da Nang. So I stepped out of line for a while and talked to one of the corporals there about this and that. And then I started hearing Pleiku, 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 because they were saying that as each man stepped up to the desk, and they were handed this blank order, and that was filled in. And so then I stood back into line, and I ended up going the very place that I was supposed to go, but I had to have a little end run in order to go there. And that's not to say that that was such a wonderful place, but at least at the time I thought it was better than Da Nang, Rocket City, and which is where I might have gone. Now, Pleiku is a very strange place in a way. It was we were on a hill called Listening Hill. We weren't the only ones there. There were mortar teams. There were trucks. There were people, infantry. They were all scattered around on this hill, but we were down on one side of it with a bunch of antennas. And I was sent there, and as is true of most times in the Army, when you get there, they, at least for me it was true, they don't know what to do with you. In fact, they seem almost surprised that you're there. But there you are, you have the orders, and they say, oh, well, gee, we didn't really need anybody, but they sent you anyway. So there you are. So I ended up in a kind of a miniature motor pool that we had, and they had nothing for me to do there either much. So I sorted bolts and I cleaned tools, and I just sat around with another corporal who talked endlessly about his love life, and I just kind of sat there and we both talked about the strange place we were and what we were going to do when we got back home and all that kind of stuff.
And sorry to interrupt, but this fellow you were talking to, or talked to you, he was very graphic about his love life, in to the greatest detail. But of course, there's a caveat to that.
The thing is that he wasn't there one day, and I was sitting there alone. Left to my own devices, there was a big stack of Men's Saga magazines on the floor beside me. And so I picked one up and I started to read a story in there, and I thought, I've read this story before. And it turned out I had heard the story, I hadn't read it, but he had got most of his material from this stack of magazines. And he was very good at retelling the story in a kind of a condensed version, and just shifting himself into the spot of the main character. So after that, I got sent to take Morse code, and I did that for a while. But before I got to where I ultimately bunked, I was put in a transient barracks, and I just remember one moonlit night laying there and looking up toward the canvas top of this wooden barracks, and seeing streams of moonlight kind of coming through holes in the wooden walls around me. And I asked somebody, I said, this lumber seems to be, rather rotten. I couldn't, and he said, well, that's because that was a mortar blew up out there, and it blew holes in there, and so now that's what you're seeing. The shrapnel kind of went through in several places, and it created those holes. When I heard that, I didn't much care for sleeping there much, because they were actually, initially when I got to Pleiku, there were a fair number of times that we did get mortared, and so I slept fitfully, let's put it that way. But a couple of nights later, I got up in the middle of the night, and I went down to the helicopter launching pad, and I broke off two 90-pound pieces of steel. The launching pad was constructed of interconnected plates of steel, and I took a couple off the end that didn't seem like they were really necessary, and I took them back and I armored my cubicle with them. Not exactly cubicle, my corner of the barracks. I put the two pieces of steel together on two sides of my cot, and of course the people laughed at me because it was like 2 a.m. when I was carrying a 90-pound piece of steel in the door and clanking it down there, and people said, well, you're a pussy. But it's just funny that a few nights later we did get mortared, and I jumped under my bunk and got up next to my steel plates, and I found myself squeezed underneath my own bunk by about 6 other guys who came followed me in under my bunk as the mortar rounds came through.
Yeah.
So
well done.
So I guess I had a certain survival instinct that came out in that case, and earlier when I stepped out of line. Sometimes it seems odd, but just by stepping out of line, you can change your life.
Right, absolutely. So, so you're settling into Pleiku, not spending too much time outside what is a very secure divisional headquarters for the 4th Infantry Division, but you spent a lot of time inside of a van. In fact, it's your job. Try to give us a little bit of detail of what it's like to be, or what it was like to have that position in the ASA, and what happened inside that van.
Well, okay, there were a couple of vans, and I moved through a couple of them. The first one, I listened to Morse code. I wasn't terribly good at that, and so they said, well, we're going to put you somewhere else where you don't have to really listen to Morse code so much, but you just you take it down by running a tape recorder. So I was put into a place called wideband, and that wideband referred to the tape, which was about a 2-foot diameter reel of tape, maybe 2 inches wide. The tape was 2 inches wide, and I put it on a giant tape recorder, and it taped the whole bandwidth of. It would be like a tape recorder, if you can imagine it, that would tape every single FM and AM station on the air at a given time.
Right.
And so it was taping a broad band of signals that were in the area, in the frequency range of the Morse code that we were listening to. So I ran that tape recorder inside that little room there, and the tape recorder needed air conditioning. And so as a result, I spent 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in this little air-conditioned van, which was kind of a good thing if you think about what the climate is like.
Right.
In Vietnam, which is 90 degrees all the time and 100% humidity, or so it seemed. So I did that, and of course that little area was a secure area, so nobody could come into that area unless we could check them through a camera that we had at the door. The result was that a lot of guys got hold of marijuana and they smoked it in there, and so amidst all the lights of the glowing lights of the oscilloscopes that we had, and the filters that we used to filter out interference on the signal that would affect the ability to record all these different signals on the wideband. So that's what I did, and as I did that, which wasn't smoked marijuana, by the way, I actually read books because there was absolutely nothing to do in there except turn a few dials occasionally, and every 12 hours to take the tape off and put it in a box and send it to Arlington, Virginia.
So you've got this very sort of closed-in area, sort of psychedelic, gyroscope, oscilloscopes, and whatnot, creating all these very far-out lights. And so you'd read, but you had colleagues who would walk down to the antenna field, right? And something in particular grew wild down there.
You could harvest your own in certain areas on that hill because marijuana grew quite naturally in Vietnam, and some people could harvest it from beneath the antennas in our antenna fields. But it didn't really grow that profusely there. Most of them got it from people who went into town. Now, I only went into town once while I was there, in the town being Pleiku, which
Right.
was a kind of a refugee city, swollen by people who were forced out of the countryside by all the bombing and the killing, and who gathered into places like Pleiku and made what living they could there. So it was a hotbed of vice, I think, is one way to put it.
Right.
And but because of my top secret security clearance, I only was allowed to leave that hill twice. Once for R&R, which I took in Hong Kong, and once to go downtown just to see what it was like down there. And what it was just shacks and little storefronts and people just kind of milling around, not having a whole lot to do.
Yeah. So you basically run your 12 months in Vietnam, just working in a dedicated manner to the ASA, and then suddenly one day you're done.
That's right. I think we were luckier in a sense than today's veterans who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, because they've gone back again and again, where I didn't go back, and most of the Vietnam vets didn't have to go back. They could volunteer to go back, but most that I knew never did go back. And so we didn't have year after year of that kind of thing, which was more true year after year, was what people got in World War II.
Right.
Although it was once the war was over, it was over, where, of course, in our most recent wars, they never seem to be over. And so people go back again and again, and yet the war continues.
It keeps
So,
going, right. So you finish up in Vietnam, but you're not done with your service. Where does that take you? Where are you off to now after Vietnam?
Just to leave Vietnam, it's one of the books I read while I was sitting there changing the reels of tape was called The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And I did relate pretty strongly to that sense of unreality that I had, and is true of that book too, where the hero is in a tubercular sanatorium in Switzerland on top of a mountain.
Right.
And I often felt that I was in some kind of a lunatic asylum there because of the behavior certain people was just well, I guess maybe it's to be expected when you get a bunch of mostly teenage boys together with lots of guns and explosives and marijuana, things like that, marijuana, alcohol, all of that. It created a very bizarre, almost dreamlike feel to the place. I can remember people taking apart claymore mines and taking out little bits of the plastic explosive and kind of stepping on it and blowing it up. Of course, they had to know how big a piece because it's pretty powerful stuff, but they would do that. Other people would just fire grenades out into nowhere, out in front of our line, just to add to the what they call harassment and interdiction, right. The H&I fire. They would do that, and I occasionally fired a machine gun out there, but only as we did that periodically, mainly to keep the things clean, I think. Fired a 50 caliber machine gun out into there. So there was a lot of arms out there, but interestingly enough, we were not allowed to have rifles with us. The rifles were kept separately. The Army didn't trust us with a rifle, and I can't say I blame them either. I didn't trust some of us with a rifle either. But anyway, it was a very strange year, but thanks to that year in Vietnam, a hazardous duty station, I was given my choice of where to go next, and I had more than 2 years to go in my service commitment, so I chose a place called Bad Aibling, which is about 20 miles south of Munich.
Right.
And that was considerably different duty. It was more like being in a fraternity than being in the Army, and it was a much nicer climate, needless to say. And I got to see a good part of Europe during my various time offs, although I did have, again, 12-hour days, 7 days a week at times, depending on how many people we had doing the job in Europe. But I listened to Morse code there, too. I didn't run a tape recorder, but I ended up in another room, but this time listening to Yugoslavians and Hungarians and Czechs sending Morse code from Soviet bloc or units in Eastern Europe.
Now, you told me that you guys, over time, your sense of hearing and knowing could become so refined that you could almost know who was tapping the Morse code.
Well, that's true. If you listen to someone sending Morse code long enough, they have a very particular sound that they make, and it becomes possible to know that this same person is sending now, say, from a different area. And that's one way of finding out how units are moving around. And that's one of the things that the information that we were getting was used back again in Arlington, which is and was the headquarters of the National Security Agency, which I discovered I was working for several years into my service. ASA is just a military branch of the NSA, and all our stuff went back there to be to be decoded, in a sense. That is, de-encrypted, because everything we copied was still encrypted for the most part.
Right. And of course, Army Security Agency is a very sanitized sort of title, and not so much aligned to what.
Well, actually, that was how I ended up there in the first place, because the sergeant said there are no Army Security Agency in Vietnam, so of course you wouldn't go to Vietnam if you joined up. But they had what they did is they changed the name. They changed it to Radio Research.
That's right.
And so I became a radio research operator. If you can imagine, it's a very benign title, I guess. And I heard, whether or not it's true, that the reason that we used that term radio research was that according to the Geneva Convention, it's illegal to spy in the way we did in Vietnam. But I find that a little bit hard to believe, but that's what I was told.
Right. So you put in your time, and you finish up your commitment with the Army, and because of that, you're able to leverage the GI Bill and a lot of really fine benefits from the military, which takes you back to the Bay Area. Tell us a little bit about what you did next in the Bay Area.
Well, I don't think that the GI Bill benefits were much on my mind when I was drafted. In fact, if somebody had said you can have all these benefits, would you want to go? I would have said, no, I think I'll stay home and I'll skip the benefits. But there they were, and they actually changed my life in this sense that the Army, like most people, I went to school all the way through high school. Then I went to college, and it was kind of a thing that I always expected to do. It was almost like putting one foot in front of the other. You were going to go to college, or at least that's the way my parents raised me. So I went to college, and then comes the end of it, when mostly you're thinking about what career you're going to choose, when suddenly that choice is no longer yours, and this sort of lockstep you've been in, this one foot after the other, is completely thrown up, and you end up doing something you don't want to do and never thought about doing. So that, as it turns out, gives you time to think about what it is you might want to do. And I had 4 years of that, sort of cooling my heels to think about what sort of career might be useful or might be best for me. So when I was in the Army in Europe, I was a history major, and I thought, well, I would be a teacher of history. I would get a degree a master's degree in history, and I was able to start on that in Europe because the University of Maryland offered college courses in the German language. So I took those courses, and because of that, it got me in to the master's program at San Jose State. Because you needed, at least at the time, 2 languages, and I had 4 semesters of French and 4 of German. So I got into the program, and I was there a year. And the GI Bill kicked in, and it paid for that. And there was enough money coming in that when I got a job, I could move out because I was living with my parents again, believe it or not. After spending 4 years in the military, I came home and I was living back at home. And that was not satisfactory to me. But it took me a year to finally figure out that I loved books, and that I'd read a lot of books, that I liked bookstores and libraries, and that I felt at home there in them. And so I decided to get a degree in that. This was after I got my credential and my history degree, but found there were no jobs, except those jobs as what were called, or still are called, freeway flyers, where you've got jobs all over the place, but nobody ever gives you tenure. And so I didn't like that. But at the time, libraries were still hiring, and it was possible to get a job that located you in one place doing one full-time job instead of flying all over to different jobs. So I got a job in a library, and that I also used the GI Bill, or the GI points on the exam. So those GI points helped me in my first 2 jobs, which was a library assistant and then a librarian. I got those jobs in part because I got help on the test through those veterans points, they call them. And after I finished my schooling, since we're on the subject of the GI Bill, I got a CalVet loan for my first house and a VA loan for my second house. And while I was a member of CalPERS, there was a program that allowed me to buy 4 years of retirement time based on the 4 years I've spent in the military. So a lot of those benefits kicked in and really helped me along all the time, almost up until the present day, after I left the Army. So
right, and of course, you are a librarian. Once a librarian, always a librarian, and you spent time at the California State Library with the history section, and then you moved to the Sutro Library in San Francisco, a genealogy library. One of the great stories, and you touched upon it a little bit earlier, was how you're sitting in this van in Pleiku in the Central Highlands, and tape recorder's running, and really all you've got are those books. You have those books, and you read hundreds of them.
Well, it's one of those things about the Army that was kind of surprising in a way. We used to get pallets of beer. Carling's Black Label springs to mind, an absolutely hideous beer. But every so often, instead of beer, we'd get a pallet of books, and they'd be brought by helicopter and set down there right outside what we called our library. And we had a room where we had a lot of books, which we called a library. And so they'd be trundled in and just kind of thrown on the shelves, and they were a surprisingly well-chosen bunch of books. I mentioned The Magic Mountain. That was a book that was delivered by someone. I think they were donated by people at home and then brought there by the Army and set down there for anybody who might choose to read a book, and a fair number of people did. And it wasn't just classics, but there were a lot of classics, both fiction and nonfiction, that were given to us. I will say that I think the quality of books was far better than the quality of beer that we were served in that place.
And of course, you well understood the quality of good books, reading good books. But in time, and what I'm really excited to talk about is that you've also become a creator of content, and you've recently published a book, Dreams of War. So you're a writer. Tell us a little bit about the book, what it's about, and then also how our viewers can get a hold of it.
Well, the dream I've alluded to in the sense that it seemed like I was in a kind of dream. On top of that, Listening Hill in Pleiku, because of the strange things that happened. And one of the things that happened, and it's a curious thing, is that when I arrived there, and was not expected, of course, and they didn't know what to do with me, I got off, I guess, a C-130, and I wandered around, and I found a van that was going to Listening Hill. Nobody really told me what to do or where to go, but I found someone who seemed to be going where my order said that I was expected to be. So I got into this package van, as it turned out, and but there was no room for me in the cab, so they put me in the back, which was entirely closed and dark, except as we started to drive, the light came through because there was a hole in the side of the van, and it was like being inside a camera obscura inside. And then as we drove through various parts of Pleiku. The whole image outside was projected inside, only upside down, and so as we passed by this dim image of what was going on outside, with everybody walking on the ceiling, kind of hanging like flies from a ceiling, and this strange assemblage of soldiers and Vietnamese and people walking, people playing marbles in the street, whatever it might have been, was there projected inside this van. And I got to know that guy who drove the van, and he was one of the big potheads of the base. He was some kind of a courier, and he got to go off base a lot. So he was, I guess, the person who brought the marijuana back, and he did so. And I believe that's why I wasn't allowed to sit in the front of the van, because he had a big pillow full of it up there, and I guess he didn't want me to see it. So I sat in the back, and it's funny because it was through that guy that I became a courier briefly. After my stint in the motor pool, they still didn't know what to do with me, so they said, you can be a courier. And it sounded like a good thing to do, because being in the Army or stationed on top of a hill like that is a few seconds or minutes of sheer terror, and then hours and hours, days, weeks of terrible boredom. It's just incredible how boring it can be. Those books kind of saved me from a lot of it, but even books sometimes are not enough. The boredom. So being a courier kind of appealed to me, because you get on a plane and fly somewhere, right, and do something. And so I became a courier for just a few weeks, and the only job I remember is that I was told to take this unmarked package to Nha Trang, which was a place out on the coast with a nice beach. And what they said it was, but it wasn't marked, was an air conditioner. And I would guard that air conditioner with my life, because it was a highly sought-after piece of equipment there in Vietnam. So I accompanied that. Well, actually, what happened was that I went down to the air base, and I got into a bunker there, and I put my air conditioner out on in the front of the bunker, and I was going to wait for the next plane to Nha Trang, but the plane came and I fell asleep, and so the air conditioner left without me and went down there. And but nobody knew what it was, so I had a reasonable expectation that maybe I could find it. So I went down there on the next plane, and I asked them where stuff went, just kind of generally. And they said, well, what do you mean, what stuff? It goes to whoever's addressed to. I said, well, there wouldn't have been any address on this one. And so they said, well, chances are, if we don't know where it's going to go, it goes out there to see that field full of junk out there. The field of junk has it. And so I went out there, and I wandered around, and I did find it. It was a kind of a lucky break, because I don't know what they'd have done to me if they realized I fell asleep and the air conditioner flew away without me. But I found it out there, and I found it because where it was in a new sort of, the grass was higher out there and greener than it was closer into to the older pieces of junk. So then I took it, and it went wherever it went, because I never saw it again. But in the meantime, I was given a 3-day pass there, but part of which time I spent cutting sod for the colonel's bunker, or at least that's what we were told we were doing. And so we went out and cut pieces of turf and put it on this bunker that was near the headquarters of the colonel, who was whoever it was. I never really questioned about what it was. And then I spent a couple of days just kind of swimming out there in that tiny surf. The Nha Trang is on the ocean, right, and it has a very tiny surf, inch-high waves and things like that, and drinking beer. And then I went on back to Pleiku. So that story, or a piece of it, appears in this book, and that's one part of the kind of the dream of it. The other part is simply that 30 years had gone by before I decided to write anything down, and it did seem like a dream. It's so far distant now. Now, as we speak, it's more like 50 years, and it's a very strange thing when I recall World War II as a 5-year-old. Was only 5 years old. I mean, had ended 5 years before, and it seemed a lot more real to me as a 5-year-old than this war does. Now 50 years passed, and it seems as if what on earth was going on out there? I have strong memories of it, and yet it does seem as if it was sort of like a dream, what with the strangeness of a lot of the things I did, and the things that I remember being done to me.
Right. Well, so Dreams of War by Tom Fante, you can find it on Amazon.com in its print form, and then you can also get the e-version of it. And I can tell you that it's very well written. You're an excellent writer. The prose is super, and touches of Pleiku, touches of Tom's life, and very worth taking a read, if you will. So with that, Tom, I would like to thank you for coming on Valley to Vietnam. Right. And of course, welcome home, and welcome home to all of our veterans. This does include this episode of Valley to Vietnam. For Jerry Ward and India Curry, our producers, my name is James Scott. Thank you so much for tuning in to Valley to Vietnam, and we'll see you next time.